We're going to close the program with a message from David Kranzler. Because of time limitations, it's sort of a summary, but he will be speaking at greater length at the where is it? The Israel Center on Thursday night. I hope all of you will or most of you anyway, will get a chance to talk to him. You can't talk about rescue or the history of rescue without bringing David Kranzler's name to mind. He's written 10 books on the subject, and probably he's the historian's historian on this subject. So without any further introduction, I bring you David Kranzler.
Just two little asides. May I add my kudos to Larry, who has become my very good friend and very good opponent, intellectual opponent. I hope we both learn from each other. Second of all, there's a common denominator between Mr. Brook and Larry and myself. We all went to his father, and we all went to the same yeshiva in Brooklyn. Same little background. And let me get to the Swiss people who have become my mania, as Larry would say, because they have never been given the gratitude to which we Jews owe such an enormous debt. Let me start with the time is June 19th, 1944. The place is Budapest. The circumstances, 12,000 Jews a day are deported from Hungary to Auschwitz. The author of the following letter is Moshe Kraus, head of the Palästina Amt in Budapest, who was hiding out in the Swiss compound in Budapest. He writes, among other things, 335,000 Jews were deported by June 7th, and since then another 100,000. It will soon be the turn of Budapest, where the ghetto system has already begun. The entire Jewish race is condemned to death. There is no possibility of concealment. We do not even have the possibility of escaping to a neighboring country. There are only two possibilities left to us: suicide or the acceptance of our fate. The Swiss legation in Budapest has done its best, but unfortunately without any success whatsoever. And he concludes, help, help, help. Rudolf Kastner, Philip Freudiger, and other Jewish leaders in Hungary all came up with one single phrase: only a miracle can save us. At the rate they expected, in 3 weeks, the rest of Hungarian Jewry in and around Budapest, which about 250,000 Jews, would be gone. And Moshe Kraus said, someday please tell the world, he told the messenger that came, a Romanian diplomat, what happened to Hungarian Jewry. He gave up, as did the other leaders. Well, a miracle did happen. The human vehicles, the messengers of that miracle, were essentially two components. One is George Mantello, the Jewish El Salvadoran diplomat in Geneva, who could have been resting on his laurels, maybe even kvetch a little and give a few dollars and complain about what's happening to the Jews. And the other is the Swiss people. I've worked on Mantello and his story, and he has been given his due share in my book, but now I'd like to concentrate on the Swiss people who haven't been given their share. All major Jewish organizations, incidentally, had copies of the Auschwitz report, the 33-page big copy and 5-page Hebrew copy summary by Rabbi Weissman. He himself brought it to the board of Switzerland with couriers sent it to 4 major Jewish organizations: the Hechalutz, to Relico, to Sternbuch organization, and to Salimayo, the Joint. They got copies of these 2 reports. I interviewed Nathan Schwab, and he showed me overnight he translated both copies into German, printed it on his stationery, dated May 17th. And the historians at Yad Vashem just discovered that they were brought into Switzerland May 17th, not at the end of June. None of them showed it to George Mantello, even though all of them received free thousands of Salvadoran citizenship papers that ended up, by the way, way, becoming the most important rescue tool throughout the war. It was what Lutz emulated, and in turn Wallenberg and the other neutral diplomats utilized as models. Mantello, originally a Hungarian Jew, sought to find out what's happening with Hungarian Jews. He had his family there. He had his fellow Jews there in great danger, but nobody knew exactly what was happening. The Germans had kept a great secret of what was happening in Hungary. They managed to conceal the entire horrible crime. 10,000, 12,000 Jews a day were being sent to Auschwitz, and as mentioned before, the two escapees in April 44 that were the basis for the report that Rabbi Weissmandl in his underground with the Gysi Fleischmann took down as the Auschwitz reports were still concealed. Nobody knew what Auschwitz was like. Maybe it was a labor camp was the assumption, and it took the Swiss people to tell the world what Auschwitz was like. But far more than that, Mantello obtained, I won't go into detail how he got those connections, American and British intelligence, whom he had helped, provided him with a forum, the British News Exchange. When he got the reports of Moshe Krauss, the two reports, the two Weissmandl summary and the Hungarian report, he gave it to the British News Exchange. They made a news release and started publishing it in the Swiss paper. Now, the Swiss had a very strong, severe censorship rule. No articles may be written, of bad articles about the Nazis, unless it had been published in a neutral country before. So they put on an Ankara dispatch as if it had been published in Turkey. And the first newspaper article came out 4 days after the reports were brought, the report and that letter by Krauss were brought to Mantello. In the Swiss press, Neue Zürcher Zeitung was the first article, and within the next 5-6 weeks, there was an extraordinary array of over 400 articles condemning Auschwitz, the Nazis, and the Hungarian complicity in this most horrific crime, telling the world what Auschwitz was like. It was a death camp. They describe it in the most graphic detail and the most humanitarian perspective. What was Auschwitz? What were the Hungarians and Nazis doing to the people in Hungary, to the Jews in Hungary? Yes, I should say the people of Hungary, because the Swiss people saw them not as Jews, but as human beings like you and we, as some of the headlines will mention in a moment, described. And so Mantello, with the help of Paul Vogt, the most popular preacher in Switzerland, the help of great theologians like Karl Barth and several others, lifted up the level of the Swiss people. And I don't talk about the banks, I don't talk about the government, and I don't talk about the Red Cross. I'm talking about the Swiss people, the average nameless people who rose to a level of moral heights that no country in the world has ever emulated. In these 400 articles in 120 Swiss newspapers, that's virtually 95 or 98% of the newspapers. There were a few Nazis in Switzerland. There were a few Nazi newspapers, but at least over 90% of the Swiss people, not just some Swiss, were represented by the readership of these 120 newspapers, by the sermons in every church. Paul Vogt made sure of that. An extraordinary array of sermons on the same subject as the newspapers, condemning Auschwitz, the Nazis, and Hungarian complicity. Within 10 days, there was a worldwide response. Suddenly, Roosevelt responded through Cordell Hull, Churchill responded through Anthony Eden, the Pope responded, and the King of Sweden responded, all warning Horthy, the regent of Hungary, who suddenly reasserted his power. He sent back Eichmann to Germany and brought in his Hungarian troops into Budapest. There were only 60 SS men in Hungary at the time. And all of a sudden, the Germans are going crazy. What happened to Horthy? He was cooperating with us. And suddenly, he's deciding he's going to stop deportations. Mantello received the report on the night of June 20th. By June 24th, the first article appeared. And within 10 days of that first article, by July 7th, the trains were stopped. Horthy stopped the trains as a result of the Swiss press campaign, period. Nothing else accomplished that feat. And the Germans were going crazy. how come he suddenly stopped cooperating with us? But the Swiss people were not satisfied. That's not enough. They started suddenly attacking their own government and the Red Cross for their indifference to the fate of the Jews of Hungary. All of a sudden, this nation, which was an island of peace and serenity and beauty, you couldn't find a more beautiful scenery and sights than in Switzerland, out of the range of the war, certainly the Holocaust, not knowing what Auschwitz was like. Jews had the Auschwitz reports 6 weeks earlier and did nothing with it to publicize it. But the Swiss people were so taken aback under the inspiration of their great preachers that they publicized the Auschwitz report. They attacked the government Red Cross. I'll give you a few samples of the headlines. You'll get an idea what these 400 articles were like. Nothing like that appeared in any country in the world. And so they attacked them so strongly that they finally caved in. When Karl Barth writes a letter to the Bundesrat, they listened. He was like the Pope for the Swiss Evangelical Church, the only church, by the way, in the world that can be proud of its entire church record during the Holocaust. Let me give you an example of some of the articles, the headlines that were in these newspapers. The tragedy of Hungarian Jewry. A cry of pain fills the world. Murdered by gas and burnt. The extermination of the Jews. A storm of indignation over Switzerland. Swiss protests against the murderers of the Jews. The Swiss protest barbaric extermination of the Jews. For the sake of humanity. There is no neutrality vis-a-vis such criminality. The vaunted neutrality of Switzerland that kept them out of wars for centuries, suddenly they just disappeared. And the censorship, they said to hell with the censorship. After 10 days, they disregarded the censorship, published open articles decrying everything they weren't supposed to print, and they couldn't care less what the censor said. And you know what? That law, that Swiss alien law mentioned before, which I knew about when I wrote the book about Rettich Sternbuch, incidentally it's being translated into Hebrew, that law was suddenly disappeared. By July 12th, there was no more such law, no more discrimination against Jews coming across the border, because the will of the Swiss people had become manifest in every newspaper virtually, and in almost every church. And that represented a spirit that no one in the world could emulate. They stopped the deportations. Wallenberg came 2 days after the stopping of the deportation. Horthy, for a while, kept things quiet, but Eichmann didn't let things go like that. So he engineered a pro-Nazi Shalashi coup, which succeeded on October 15th. And that's when the neutral diplomats, under the guidance and the inspiration of Wallenberg, and people like Lutz and Perleska and Angela Rota, etc., did their finest work in rescuing, even in those last months, because the Shalashi regime wanted the recognition by the neutral diplomats. So they had hung over the balance, and still thousands of Jews were killed because some people never even bothered looking at papers, nor the protected houses or protected anything. And they simply shot Jews, including my wife's grandmother. They just threw her in the Danube. But as a result of the action by Mantello and the Swiss people that have never been recognized, the trains were stopped and continued work. The Red Cross and the government, which was so criticized by their own press and church, suddenly did a marvelous job in Budapest, as we know what Lutz did, and we know the Red Cross protected all the institutions. So at the end, approximately 140,000 Jews were rescued. Some Jews had to be rescued 2 or 3 times. But at the moment the train stopped, that was already one rescue. Later on, Jews had to be rescued again and again, given the tragic circumstances. Now you'll understand. Let me just read example snippets of 2 articles, so you not only know the headlines, but what is the feeling of the article. One of them said, for example, a profound upheaval has seized the entire Swiss nation, leaving no doubt about the accuracy of the reports, and has given us an insight into the gruesome fate that has befallen Hungarian Jewry. When we realize that this is happening in the midst of Europe, in whose culture we have taken such great pride, and in a country especially proud of its Christianity and chivalry, we can no longer practice the reserve of neutrals. But we are required to raise our voices, not only as men and as Christians, but also as Swiss people, when hundreds of thousands of defenseless people, they're not Jews, people, are sent to their deaths. There is no neutral way. of ignoring such behavior. The second article, entitled We Women, reads in part, protests are a platonic gesture, yet there are events against which one must protest. Because if the humanity is silent, then the stones must cry out. What has been happening to the Jewish people, like all others before God, are also our brothers. We cannot turn away. We women as well want to raise our voice in an emotional, passionate protest. And a small slice of the hundreds of sermons, this one was delivered by Paul Vogt, the chief architect of the church campaign. O holy God, it is with profound shame and deep fear that we come before thee today. We are not worthy of standing before thee because we Christians loved so little and had so little faith, with the result that in the midst of Christendom, godlessness seeks to exterminate the entire Jewish people, and we can no longer prevent it. O Father, have mercy, forgive us our enormous sin. And the result of these press and church campaign was the trains were stopped, and the continuation of the Swiss government and Red Cross, in combination with the diplomats from other countries such as Wallenberg, etc., accomplished the second half of that great rescue feat. Now you have some idea of, well, let's say, shall we ponder these extraordinary facts and think about their profundity and see why we think the Swiss people, as such, deserve our gratitude.
We shall be finishing, I'll take the mic. Bill, it's all right if I take the microphone from you? Yes. We shall be finishing in about 5 minutes. We have two more very short items. The evening took a bit longer than we planned, but we're getting near the close. What I'd like to say, just one paragraph about what David has said. Many of these things are controversial. They require discussion. And I think that is what is missing. David, for example, should be challenged if somebody doesn't believe some of the things that he says, or some nuances are not right. And we need a forum where these kind of things can be discussed appropriately so we can polish historical fact like the river polishes its stones and come up with something that's perfect, as much as perfect as history can be.